Hello and welcome to episode 18 of Reflecting the Way Radio. I'm your host, Evan. Let's get started. This episode, we are talking about Saturn, Freemasonry, and the occult nature of reality. Now, if you've been following along in the series, this may not sound that out of place to you. If you haven't, I would definitely recommend you go back and listen to previous episodes. Either pause it right now and go back and listen, or go back and listen once you've listened to this entire episode. You may not have much context moving forward here if you haven't been following along, but nonetheless, we will soldier on. This is the companion audio episode to the article of the same name on our website at www.reflectingtheway.com. The article is linked in the description box below. If you haven't taken the time to head over and check out our Facebook or Twitter pages, I would highly encourage you to do that. We can be found on Facebook. We are Reflecting the Way. And on Twitter, we are at Reflect the Way. Also, if you're on the website, I would also encourage you to sign up for the email list. We don't flood your inbox by any means. We usually send out an update about once every 3 or 4 weeks. So you won't be getting spammed from us. And that will keep you in the loop as to what's going on with new content, new episodes, stuff like that. And with that, let's get started. So I'll say right at the top here that of all the articles in this series so far, we're on part 9, not counting the introduction, I found this particular section to be incredibly difficult to write. And the reason for that is the concepts that I'm trying to get across here, it was made exceedingly obvious to me as I wrote the article that it's not something that can simply be intellectually explained. It can be explained in a physical context, but without spiritual discernment, you cannot understand this. You may think you understand it, or you may think, what's the big deal? But if you don't have eyes to see and ears to hear, and you don't have a certain level of discernment and or spiritual maturity, you either won't get what the concept is here, or you will misconstrue this as deception, which it isn't. It's the uncovering of deception, and you might understand what I mean by that as we move ahead here. So in the article, I spent a not inconsequential amount of space setting up caveats for what I was going to say, and I will address that here just a little bit, because if you've been following this series so far, you will realize that most of what we have covered has been somewhat objective, though admittedly alternate issues of fact and stuff like that. There hasn't been much practical application for the information that we've covered. It's been facts, figures, history, that sort of thing. Now, moving forward from this point on, that is changing. The buildup has been towards this, the spiritual implication of the Saturnian system that we're living in. And if you have an eagle eye and a really sharp sense of discernment, you may have started to get a sense, reading the articles and listening to the audio episodes, of where this series is headed, though I'm sure many listening to this episode haven't, because I haven't made it obvious, and I've done that on purpose. I wanted to come across a little bit more objectively with the facts and the history, and keep making sure that there's a bit of a baseline of understanding before we move into the spiritual implications. Now, you may think this is going too far once we move ahead here, and so be it. If you're not ready for this, or you don't believe this, that is completely your right. So all I'll say to that is, if you're in that camp, that's fine. This isn't for everybody. I understand that. But I'm digging to the bottom of this rabbit hole, and if you don't want to help, that's okay. You can stay at the top. Just, if you stay at the top, don't be shoveling dirt down on the heads of me and everybody else down here that are digging, and don't try and turn it into our grave. And that's maybe all I'll say about that. And just to add a little bit of punch to that statement, I would encourage you to go look up Hosea chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, where God says that if you reject knowledge, he will reject you. And kind of along that line, where we're going here with this series, it's important to keep the words of Jesus, I believe it was Luke 6, in your mind, where he tells a parable and commends the unjust or worldly steward for conducting himself the way he did. And he says that the children of the world are wiser than the children of light in their generation. And that's not a pat on the back. Jesus wasn't giving you license to be ignorant when he said that. It was an admonition. He was telling you the dark side knows something that you people don't, and you need to know it. You need to understand what's going on here. Now, I understand that when Jesus spoke in parables, there's many layers to the meaning. That's why he spoke in parables. He said that he spoke in parables so that those without ears to hear wouldn't understand, and those with the ears to hear would comprehend the greater, deeper things of the kingdom. This is the same chapter that the often quoted verse comes from, talking about if you've not been faithful with unrighteous or filthy mammon, however it puts that, how will you handle your true riches? And obviously that is a reference to money on the surface. Absolutely it is. And there's many ways that can be applied to finances and money issues. But again, there's more layers of meaning. And another way to consider looking at that is to treat that unrighteous mammon as the knowledge that the occult world possesses, and to properly and faithfully handle that unrighteous mammon or unrighteous knowledge is to rightly divide truth from deception. When we look at this particular topic, not just this section, but everything from here on out, it's an old, tired, worn-out cliche, but it's like rat poison. It's 99% good food. It's the 1% that kills you. What we're going into here now is lots of it. The information itself is actually neutral. It's neither good nor evil. It simply is a fact. Where it becomes evil, that 1% that kills you, is the occult application and understanding of the fact. Okay? Now, the unfortunate thing here is that through a couple thousand years of church history, believers have been so wrapped on the knuckles for looking anywhere outside the canonical 66 books that much of this understanding is simply, it's not even misunderstood, it is not even known about in the mainstream church. And the only people that carry this knowledge at this point, I shouldn't say the only, but by and large this is true, that for the most part, the only people in this world that understand this knowledge, or even have this knowledge to begin with, are the arcane arts, the occult schools, and the mystery schools. Freemasonry being a chief prime example. Everybody's familiar with the Freemasons. I'm sure if you're listening to this, that's not the first time you've heard of that particular fraternity. So that's kind of the place where we're going to start. And this saturates almost every single occult school and theology that you can find, with a couple of exceptions like LaVeyan Satanism, for instance, which is frankly little more than a parody of Satanism or a parody of Christianity, depending how you want to look at it. But any true old ancient occult school, or even the newer serious occult schools like Thelema or the OTO, Order of the Golden Dawn, stuff like that, this is so fundamentally interwoven into their fabrics that you can't escape it. And like I said, lots of this information is neutral. It's the application that's evil. So if you're looking at the article, or if you've read it, you'll know that I have posted a picture of a Masonic tracing board. And if you listened to our previous episode or read our previous article, 9/11 and the Antichrist System, if you haven't checked that out, we talked about the seal of Saturn and the square and compass being placed between the two pillars, forming an IXXI, which is 9/11, which is a hidden theology of the mystery schools, ascension to godhood. I don't have time to explain that here again now, but go check it out. We've also talked about in the past section how that square and compass is in fact a stylized version of literally the seal of Saturn. Now, I said in that last section that maybe you thought the link between Masonry and Saturnianism was somewhat tenuous. Well, consider this. If you read or listened to I believe it was our second section or our second chapter in this series about the symbols of Saturn, you know that Saturn and Saturn worship are fundamentally dualistic. The deity is dualistic and the system is dualistic. If you're a student of Freemasonry or conspiracy theories or whatever, you'll also know that Freemasonry is fundamentally dualistic. Most famously, this is depicted in Masonic art and on tracing boards and in the lodge itself by showing black and white floor tiles. That is the most obvious in-your-face example of dualism in Masonry. Now, we also said in that second chapter that Saturn, as a dualistic deity, had both female and male divinity within itself, or as part of the deity as a whole. Now, Masonry has the same thing, and if you're a student of Freemasonry, there's been a great deal done about the symbols and the theology of Masonry, so I won't break it down in any detail, but the square and compass, most famously associated with the Masons, you may have heard it said, and correctly so, that represents male and female. It does. It also represents as above, so below, that whole mess, and like I just mentioned before, IXXI, 9/11, which is ascension to godhood or apotheosis. But there's another somewhat hidden reference to Saturn here, and once you know what you're looking at, it's actually not all that hidden at all, but to the average observer, this would pass right over their head. Now, two of the chief symbols of Saturn are the cube, which represent the male aspect of the deity, and that comes from the perfectly hexagonal storm found on the north pole of the planet, which was visible to the ancients most likely. That perfectly hexagonal storm, a hexagon is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional cube. Just draw a cube and look at the outside perimeter, you'll see what I mean. And from that cube, we can derive all sorts of symbols like the square, the X, the X bisecting the square. It also has 6 sides, obviously. The important part there, though, is the square. The cube as well, but the square is simpler for this explanation. The feminine aspect of Saturn comes right down to its rings. And actually, scratch that. Before I go there, I just want to mention that the square and the cube represent space, as in the spatial dimensions in which we move. Forward, back, left, right, up, down. The square has 4 sides, just like the 4 cardinal points in the compass. Make it a 3-dimensional cube, and there you have your up and down. That's our 3D world. That represents space. It's also the masculine. The female aspect of Saturn is represented by the planet's rings. And the rings represent the cyclical nature of time and the female aspect of the deity, female divinity. Now, we've covered this a few different ways in a few different chapters, so if you're just jumping in here, you're probably completely lost. So I would encourage you to go start at the beginning, but we got to keep moving forward here. So when you look at the square and compass, this should already be ringing a bell in your head here. What does a square measure and draw? Well, it draws and measures squares, right? The masculine aspect of the deity. And a compass draws and measures what? It measures and draws circles, the female aspect of the deity. So not only does that affirm other researchers' findings about the male and female aspects of that symbol, but it's also a direct link back to the Saturnian system. So Masonry has this tie to Saturn. And many researchers, especially on the interwebs, would tell you that Jewish Kabbalah and Masonry, sorry, not Saturnianism, Masonry and Jewish Kabbalah are one and the same. And granted, there are a great number of similarities and a huge amount of influence that comes from the Judeo-Christian, I don't even want to say cosmology, but let's say tradition, that influences Masonry. Not the least of which is the fact that modern lodges, even today, are built to reflect the ancient Temple of Solomon. The two pillars, which we're going to come back to in a minute here, the pillars come from the Temple of Solomon as well. They're called Boaz and Jachin. And I do see the similarities, but I don't think it's fair to say that Kabbalah and Masonry are identical. They are different. They're kissing cousins, I suppose you could say, but they are different. Though that is another, let's say, tenuous tie to the Saturnian system. We talked about Judaism and the Tefillin being tied in with Saturn, and obviously if Masonry is tied in with Judaism, it's another link back to the same system. So moving on, I just mentioned the pillars there. When you look at a Masonic tracing board, and here's where I want to go with this episode. When you look at a Masonic tracing board, you see two pillars depicted in almost every case. Now, there is a hidden pillar in the middle, but we'll come back to that another day. I want to look at those two pillars for now. When you look at the Masonic tracing board, everything, all of the symbols and everything that is contained between those pillars represents our reality. If you look at the article, I show a piece of 18th or 19th century art that shows a medieval cosmology or an understanding of the way the universe was assembled. And you will notice on either side there is a carving of a pillar, one on each side, and it's showing the same thing. Everything between those pillars represents our physical reality. Now on that tracing board, you will also see a familiar symbol, and that is the radiant eye, or the all-seeing eye. The same thing you find on the back of your dollar bill. Now, this is commonly called the all-seeing eye of Horus, or Lucifer, or whatever. I don't care what you call the entity, this is the false light bearer. Now, in the episode description, I mentioned the difference between the true light of life and the light of death, or the anti-light of death. This is the anti-light of death. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when you join a fraternity like the Masons, or the Rosicrucians, or whatever, ultimately the goal is to become closer to, air quotes here, God, right? Which God? Well, I think probably everybody listening to this knows which God we're dealing with, but the idea is that you want to ascend through a series of degrees and levels to attain more light or greater illumination. And the light from that eye is the light that they're after. And the entity ultimately behind that eye is Saturn, or death. And I'll explain that probably a little more in depth in the next section. Just for now, let's go with this, or we'll be here for hours. So that light is the false light of the world, okay? When Jesus said that I am the light of the world, and that I am the light of life, and we are to be the light of this world, or bring his light into this world, he qualified the statement by saying he was the light of life. Now, if he had to qualify that, it would stand to reason that there is some kind of counterfeit light, or an anti-light which appears the same but does the opposite. A light of death, or an anti-light of death, which looks the same but acts in reverse. And that's what this is. That eye sits between the two pillars on the tracing board and bathes our reality in this anti-light of death, okay? Like I said, I found this incredibly hard to convey. So you have to have spiritual discernment to understand what I'm telling you here. But moving on. So this entity that sits above our reality is basically the God of this world, not the God over this world. That's the Father in heaven, but that is the God the world worships. Now, I believe it's 1 John 8. You have to check the article, make sure you get the right reference. Says that the whole world lies in wickedness. Some translations will render that the entire world lies in the evil one. And this is what it's talking about. While the Father is the God over the world, there is a little g God that rules this world in terms of the unsaved, where it says we struggle against the world, the flesh, and the devil. This is the entity over the world. This is the entity the world serves. And this entity brings a false light, a false love, a false altruism that appears true. And in many cases, even blood-bought believers are actually chasing this incorrect source of light. The entity behind this light will make all kinds of offers. The only thing it can't offer you is eternal life. But it can elevate you to extreme heights in this reality. That's where this theology of apotheosis in the mystery schools comes from, ascending to godhood. In a certain sense, the brotherhoods and the fraternities and these occult orders who attempt to reach godhood, become a living God, maybe you've seen that advert on YouTube, in a certain sense, they do become a little g God, because Saturn, or death, the entity behind the false light, can elevate them above most of this reality. But therein lies the catch, because that light permeates this reality, but it's stuck between those two pillars. It's stuck within this realm. It has limits, and it can only elevate its followers to the uttermost heights of its limit. Now, in a certain sense, this is godlike power. It is money, it's sex, it's drugs, it's power, it's occult abilities that most people would consider fairy tale. I won't go too deep into that, but we're talking transmutation of matter, we're talking teleportation, levitation, the whole 9 yards. Divination, speaking with the dead, all of it. But like I said, here's the catch. That light, which they think, I believe many of them believe they're doing the right thing. Maybe not the ones right at the top, but lots of the mid-level management probably believes that they're in it for the right reason, because the light has deceived them. The false light has deceived them. They get this power and influence in this world, but the only thing that light can really do for them is offer them a perpetual state of eternal death. This isn't in the article, but I'll call it the God of the second death, right? Not to say it is God, but you know what I'm driving at. So why would they do it? Well, like I said, they believe this is the true light, and that true light can masquerade as that false light can masquerade as the true light. Bit of a slip there, I think. And unfortunately, many Jesus followers don't know it, but they're tied into this system. And this system not only brings death, it feeds on it. It feeds on death, it feeds on negativity, it feeds on violent emotions, it feeds on our animalistic tendencies. And the next section will break down what that means, what that looks like, and how it works. But suffice it to say for now, if you listening to this right now have turned on the internet, read the news, watched the news, looked out your window, had a negative thought about your neighbor, hated your job, got up in the morning feeling like garbage, and went through your day down in the dumps, or had a fight with your spouse or kid or brother or sister or whatever, if you've ever lashed out in anger, if you've ever lashed out in fear, if you've ever succumbed to rage, if you have ever done anything in your power, strictly in your power, not of God the Father, you have been part of this system, and you still are. Unfortunately, we are stuck in this system, so to speak, in a manner of speaking. That is why we are told to be in the world, but not of it, because our Father exists above and beyond this false light. And it is our job to take the true light of life from Christ into this false lit world, lit by an anti-light of death. We are to bear the true light of life. And something I touched on in the article, and I want to touch on here real quick, is especially in more charismatic sort of Pentecostal circles of Christianity, it often gets, shouted from the rooftops, the devil is under our feet, rah, rah, rah. And that's true. But unfortunately, many times the pastors and the congregants repeating that like a battle cry don't understand what that means. Where occultists and mystery school initiates are attempting to attain this godlike power by ascending through these degrees and letting this giant anti-light life tick suck them dry on the way up and feed off of them as they try and claw their way up the ladder of degrees and levels and job promotions and attaining money. Okay, it just went from that guy down the street that's a Freemason to whoops, better look in the mirror. When you engage in that, you are feeding the system. And that entity requires that. Whereas as a believer, the reason the devil or this entity, Death, Saturn, Lucifer, Horus, call it what you want, this false light bearer, the reason it is under our feet is not because we go out and walk on it. It is under our feet because as it stands, spiritually speaking, we are already seated with Christ in heavenly places, where the enemy says, do this, do that, worship me, and maybe if you step on enough faces on your way up the ladder, maybe I'll grant you sex, drugs, money, power, long life, occult abilities, teleportation, transmutation, whatever. Rather than that, what Jesus says is, no, I did the work. Oh, by the way, I kept you a seat. Come sit here. Once you fully understand that, you will take your spiritual life to a new level. Guaranteed. That is the fundamental difference between these two systems. Now, there's more to it, and we will go into that in the next section. But the takeaway that I want you to have from this is there are two systems. One is of the world, one is of the next world. One is true light, life, and love. One is a false anti-light of death, selfish love, and fake altruism. Okay? If you don't understand anything besides that, grasp that concept. And like I said, I struggle with this because I feel like I should be explaining this better, but it can't be explained any other way. It simply has to be discerned. So when I say this system feeds off of you, I mean it literally feeds off of you. If you understand what I'm saying, great. If you don't, ask the Father. In the next section, I think the title will be something like, now don't quote me on it and don't hold me to it, but it will be something like The New Age Trojan Horse. And we're going to talk about how how do I want to put this? How the co-opters tell you can get out of this system versus how you truly get out of this system. And how this system works according to the people that worship it, that most Christians, number one, don't understand, number two, have no idea that it exists, and number three, many times will be scared of it. So if you thought this episode was a little bit out there, we've only just begun. So stay tuned for that coming up hopefully in the next week or two. And if you haven't done so, make sure you sign up for the email list so you get the notification for that episode and you get that article right when it comes out. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And I would highly encourage you to read the article. There's more meat and potatoes in the article than I was able to get to here in this episode. And with that, I will leave you and just say that I hope that in spite of my delivery, this message gets through to those who need to hear it and those who are capable of understanding it. So with that, I will leave you, and blessings.